crowd laughed. When Black Fisherman entered the tournament, he handed the $250K check back and walked out, smiling. They laughed before he even set his cooler down. A man walked through the marina gates at Pelican Cove just after 6 in the morning, rod case on his shoulder, beat-up tackle bag in his left hand, a pair of worn rubber boots that had seen 10,000 miles of shoreline. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way men move when they have nothing to prove and nowhere to be but exactly where they are. And the laughter started at the registration table, not loud, not all at once. The kind that spreads like a slow tide, a snicker from one man that catches the ear of another, a look exchanged between two sponsors in branded vests, the sound of someone trying to swallow it and failing, one voice carrying over the noise of the crowd, loud enough for the whole tent to hear. They let just anybody sign up for this thing now, huh? Nobody said stop. Not one person at that table. Not one of the 47 registered anglers standing in that morning light. Not one of the corporate sponsors in their embroidered shirts said a single word. He heard it. He set his cooler down, picked up his registration form, and signed his name in the careful, unhurried hand of a man who had been signing important documents for a very long time. His name was Calvin Doss. He was 61 years old, and by the end of that Saturday, he would hold a certified check for $250,000, and then he would hand it back. Nobody in that tent knew yet what that quiet man was about to do. Nobody knew that the man they were laughing at had taught half the tournament's own judges how to read deep water. They would find out before sundown. They always find out. Subscribe and tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now, rewind with me. 12 hours before that check was handed back. Back to where it really begins. Calvin Doss grew up on water, not near water, not with a view of water, on it. His grandfather, a man named Ezra Doss, who was born in a sharecropper's cabin in coastal Georgia in 1921, ran a small wooden skiff between the islands for 30 years, ferrying supplies and catching what the sea gave up. Ezra passed that knowledge down the way the old ones always did, not through instruction, but through proximity. Through silence and patience and the slow accumulation of watching, Calvin's father, Raymond Doss, fished the same waters, not for sport. For food, for income, for the specific kind of dignity that comes when a man can feed his children from his own hands. There were mornings in Calvin's childhood when breakfast was whatever his father pulled from the water before the sun fully cleared the pines. Mullet, redfish, speckled trout so fresh they were still stiff when they hit the pan. Calvin was 7 years old the first time his father let him hold the rod alone. Not as a game, as a lesson. His father stood behind him and said 3 words. 3 words that Calvin Doss has repeated out loud every single morning for the past 54 years. 3 words that true wealth is what you carry in your hands when the water gets hard. By the time Calvin was 14, he was reading the water better than men twice his age. Reading it the way you read a face the surface tells you almost nothing. The depths tell you everything. He learned to track current shifts by watching the way foam collected against a bank. He learned to identify feeding behavior by the subtle pressure change in a line before the strike. He learned the names of every species in his home waters, their habits, their seasons, their hiding places, the specific hours of the specific tides when they became vulnerable. He had a spiral notebook, duct-taped along the spine because it had been dropped in a John boat and dried out and dropped again. In that notebook, he recorded every significant catch from age 10 onward. Not just the fish, the date, the tide stage, the water temperature, the barometric pressure reading from the radio, the specific lure or bait, the retrieve speed. 237 pages of data compiled by a black teenager in the years when very few people in the sporting world would have thought to ask what he knew. He kept that notebook. It was in his tackle bag the morning he walked into the Pelican Cove International Fishing Tournament, and the crowd at the registration table laughed. After high school, Calvin took a position as a mate on a charter boat operating out of Savannah. He was 19. He was paid less than the white mates for the same work, and he knew it, and he stayed anyway, because the work itself was the point. The ocean was the point. Over the next 6 years on that charter, Calvin became the reason clients came back. Repeat customers who said nothing to the owner but asked specifically for Calvin when they called to book. He had a gift that cannot be taught and cannot be bought, the ability to find fish when they do not want to be found. A combination of instinct refined into something that looked, to outside observers, almost like magic. It was not magic. It was 50-page notebooks and a mind that never stopped cataloging, and a pair of eyes that had been trained since age 7 to see what ordinary eyes passed over. He moved from the charter work to independent, guiding in his early 30s, built a small reputation, built a client list, guided sport fishermen from Atlanta and Charlotte and Washington, D.C. Men who flew into small airports with expensive gear and hired Calvin to make them look like they knew what they were doing. He charged reasonable rates. He was quiet, and he was effective, and his clients won things. But Calvin himself had never entered a tournament. He had thought about it. He had the knowledge. He had more than the knowledge he had. The accumulated field intelligence of 30 years of professional guiding, thousands of hours on the water across 3 different coastal ecosystems, intimate familiarity with the specific waterways that made up the Pelican Cove tournament's competition zone. He had guided in those waters. He knew where the fish went in August when the temperature rose past 84 degrees, which was a detail that appeared in none of the tournament briefs and that none of the field competitors had taken the time to study. What had kept him out of the circuit was not ability. It was not confidence. It was the specific, accumulating weight of knowing what reception was likely to look like. He had watched the tournament world from the outside for long enough to understand its demographics, its social codes, its unspoken assumptions about who belonged behind the wheel of a competition boat. He had been on the docks at enough of these events to collect enough data on how men like him were treated. He was 61 years old. His knees were not what they were. His grandson, a boy named Marcus who was 8 and had begun to ask questions about fishing with the urgent, earnest curiosity of a child who senses a doorway opening, had told Calvin 3 weeks earlier that he wanted to watch his grandfather compete. That was the reason. A boy named Marcus who was 8 years old and believed without question that his grandfather could do anything. Calvin entered the Pelican Cove International that year with a legal registration fee of $350, a fishing license current through December, and a tackle bag that held, among other things, a duct-taped spiral notebook. True wealth is what you carry in your hands when the water gets hard. The man whose voice had carried that morning at the registration tent was named Preston Aldridge III. The third. That was important to him. He introduced himself that way. Preston Aldridge III. Sponsored by Apex Marine Components, by Suncoast Tackle Systems, by 2 energy drink brands whose logos were arranged across his vest in descending order of contract value. He drove a 42-foot offshore center console with twin 3-to-100 horsepower engines that his father had largely paid for. He had won the Pelican Cove tournament twice in the past 9 years and was widely expected to win again. He was 44 years old. He had been fishing competitively for 16 years. He was loud in the specific way of men who have been applauded long enough to confuse volume with authority. What Preston Aldridge III possessed, in abundance, was network. He knew the tournament directors. He had dinner with 2 of the judges the night before competition. He knew which boats had already scouted the prime inshore structure, and he knew this because the other teams told him, because telling Preston was a form of social currency in this circuit, a way of buying goodwill with a man who had connections to the people who ran things. What Preston Aldridge III did not possess was the duct-taped notebook. He had spotted Calvin at registration, and the laughter had come out of him before he could decide whether it was wise. The sound of a man who had never had to be wise in a room, because the room had always been his. He watched Calvin sign the form and move to the gear staging area, and he watched the way Calvin moved, and he decided, in the instant way that certain men make decisions, that this was not a threat. He walked over. That should be noted. He walked over to where Calvin was organizing his tackle bag, and the men around him followed, because that was how it worked in Preston Aldridge III's world. He said, "Big day for a first-timer. You have a boat?" Calvin looked up. A long pause. the specific silence of a man deciding how much of himself to spend on this moment. "I have a boat," Calvin said. "What kind?" "A fishing one," Calvin said, and went back to his tackle bag. Two men behind Preston laughed. Preston's face did the thing that faces do when a smaller man surprises a larger one, a brief, almost invisible recalibration before the mask reassembled. He laughed, too, as if he'd meant for it to go that way. "Well," he said, loud enough for the staging area to hear, "there's $100 bounty from me personally to whoever finishes in the top 3. Figured I'd offer some of the first-timers something to play for, since the real prize might be out of reach." A pause, the grin. "No offense." Calvin nodded slowly. He said nothing. He zippered his tackle bag closed, picked up his rod case, and walked to his boat. The boat was a 19-foot bay skiff. 8 years old, hull repaired twice, console faded by sun and salt. It was not impressive. It was not built for speed. It was built for the specific shallow water conditions that characterized the inshore structure of this particular competition zone. The kind of structure that Preston Aldridge III, with his 42-foot offshore center console and his twin 300 horsepower engines, could not access without running aground. Nobody in the staging area knew that yet. Among the 47 registered anglers that morning, 2 people noticed Calvin's boat and understood what they were looking at. One was a woman named Darlene Hooper, 63, a retired fisheries biologist from the University of Georgia, who was competing for the 4th consecutive year and had never placed higher than 11th. She watched Calvin load his skiff and said to the man beside her, "That man knows something." The other was a young deckhand working the fuel dock, a 19-year-old named Jerome who had grown up around these waters and who recognized Calvin Doss by name because Calvin had given a free half-day guide trip to Jerome's older brother 3 years ago because Jerome's brother had been asking questions and Calvin believed in answering them. Jerome watched Calvin's skiff leave the dock and said nothing. He went back to his fuel line, but he pulled out his phone and sent a text to his brother that said, "Calvin Doss is in the tournament today," and his brother, working a restaurant shift 40 miles away, sent back a single word, "Watch." Neither of them knew it yet, but by the end of that day, nearly 4 million people would be watching. The Pelican Cove International ran a 12-hour field competition. Lines in at 7 in the morning, weigh in at 7 in the evening. 6 target species with a point multiplier system: redfish, flounder, speckled trout, sheepshead, black drum, and cobia, with cobia carrying the highest multiplier and being, by far, the most difficult to locate in this zone at this time of year. A single large cobia, properly documented, could swing a standings position by as many as 8 places. The tournament had been running for 22 years. In 22 years of competition, only 3 anglers had boated a cobia in the Pelican Cove zone in August. The water temperature made it improbable. The established wisdom said cobia ran deeper and farther offshore once the inshore temperature climbed past 82 degrees. The established wisdom was recorded in Calvin Doss's notebook in an entry from 14 years ago, and it was wrong. Not entirely wrong. The cobia did move. They did respond to temperature. What the established wisdom missed, what everyone operating on received knowledge missed, was a specific thermal refuge, a deep tidal channel running beneath a spoil island in the northeastern quadrant of the competition zone, where cooler water from an upstream freshwater source created a narrow band of 80-degree temperature in an otherwise 85-degree system. Calvin had found it 15 years ago by accident while running a client on a redfish trip. He had found a single large cobia sitting in that channel and had not been able to interest the client in it because the client was focused on redfish. Calvin had written a 14-page entry about it in the notebook when he got home that evening. He had gone back 11 times since then. He had found cobia in that channel in August 7 of those 11 times, representing a 63% success rate, in a scenario where the established tournament wisdom said cobia were essentially unavailable. Calvin motored his bay skiff out of the marina at 7:02 a.m. and pointed his bow northeast. At the same time, Preston Aldridge III ran his twin 300s at full throttle toward the offshore structure. he and his dock dinner companions had agreed was the most productive zone for the tournament's target species. He was not alone. 11 boats followed his heading, in the way that boats followed dominant competitors, a school moving on the behavior of the largest fish. Calvin went the other direction. At 7:18 a.m., he cut his engine at the mouth of the channel and let the skiff drift. He sat in silence for 4 minutes, reading the water, the surface current. The color of the water where it shifted from green-brown to a darker, cooler blue-green. The way a single pelican was working the edge of the channel mouth, not diving, circling, which indicated baitfish holding at depth. He picked up the notebook and opened it to page 217, the most recent entry on this channel. Then he closed it. He had read it enough times. He picked up his rod, checked his leader, and began to fish. At 9:41 a.m., a tournament observer boat that was required to be present when an angler hooked a potential trophy-class fish received a radio call from Calvin Doss. Calm voice. The same unhurried voice he used for everything. "I've got a cobia on. Big one. You'll want to come to this position." He gave the GPS coordinates. The observer boat arrived in 11 minutes. The deckhand in the observer vessel, a man named Cole who had worked these tournaments for 7 seasons, watched Calvin fight the fish. He watched for 22 minutes. He would later tell his wife that it was the most efficient, most technically precise piece of angling he had ever witnessed in his professional life. No drama, no showboating. Every movement deliberate and economical, like watching a master craftsman build something, except that the material was a living fish and the tool was a rod and 400-yard braid, and a man who had been doing this since he was 7 years old. At 10:03 a.m., Calvin boated a cobia that Cole would measure at 56 inches and that the official scale at weigh-in would register at 62 pounds and 4 ounces. Back at the marina, the morning standings board showed Preston Aldridge III in first place with a respectable bag of 4 species. The tournament director and 3 board members were having coffee in the sponsor tent. The crowd of spectators that gathered around these events, families, dock workers, local regulars, occasional media, was thinner than it would be by afternoon. Still in the comfortable assumption that the day was proceeding normally. A woman named Darlene Hooper, running the inshore zones west of the main basin, had heard Calvin's radio call on the shared channel. She did not change her heading. She had her own area to work and her own knowledge to apply. But she said to herself, out loud in her empty boat, "He found them." And she felt something she had not felt in 4 years of competing in this event. She felt glad for someone else. At 12:19 p.m., Calvin's radio transmitted again. The observer boat had not left his position. Another cobia, 51 inches, 53 pounds, and 7 ounces. Cole, in the observer boat, called it in to the tournament director's radio. The director, mid-coffee, put the cup down. By 2:30 inches the afternoon, Calvin had amassed a 5-species bag with point totals that the tournament's scoring system had not been designed to accommodate in this combination. The 2 cobia alone had accumulated more multiplied points than the entire typical winning bag in recent years. Added to them were a redfish at 11 pounds, 3 ounces, a sheep's head at 7 pounds even, and a speckled trout that was, by 4/10 of a pound, the heaviest individual speckled trout recorded in the competition zone in 15 years. The standings board, updated every 2 hours, showed a number beside the name Doss, C, that no one in the sponsor tent could explain. Preston Aldridge III, running offshore in conditions that had turned choppy by midday, had added to his bag through the afternoon. He was fishing well. He was a skilled angler. He had 22 years of offshore tournament experience, and he was applying it with focus and efficiency. He was in second place. At 3:15 p.m., one of Preston's companions transmitted on the shared radio channel. "Cole, what exactly is happening up in the northeast quadrant?" Cole's voice came back. Brief. Factual. "Mr. Doss is having a day." A pause on the channel. Then, "Who? True wealth is what you carry in your hands when the water gets hard." The afternoon built slowly. That is the only word for it. The way a storm builds on a flat horizon visible long before it arrives, giving you time to prepare, except that no one had prepared because no one had seen it coming. By 4 in the afternoon, word had reached the spectator area. The dock community of Pelican Cove is a small world, and small worlds transmit information the way water transmits sound faster than air and with perfect fidelity. Jerome, the 19-year-old deckhand at the fuel dock, had been updating his brother since the first radio call. His brother had posted about it on 2 fishing forums and a social media account with 11,000 followers. By 4 o'clock, the posts had been shared enough times that a local news affiliate had sent a camera crew to the marina. At 4:22 p.m., a woman walked into the marina grounds with a press credential and asked the tournament director to confirm the standings. The tournament director, a man named Greg Faulkner who had run this event for 9 years, looked at the confirmation sheets in his hand and confirmed them. His voice had the quality of a man being careful to remain level. The camera crew set up near the weigh-in dock. At 5:05 p.m., Preston Aldridge III's radio call brought his final score in. He had worked hard. He had fished the right offshore zones with the right technique, and his bag was competitive by any prior year's standard. He was, in any other version of that Saturday, a tournament winner. He was not going to win. He knew it by the time the radio exchanges caught up to him on the offshore run home. He knew it from the way the other boats were talking to each other, the specific silence of people who have been surprised and are rearranging their understanding of a situation. He knew it from the standings update that came through at 5:30, which showed a margin that was not a close race but a demonstration. Nobody spoke directly to him about it. They did not have to. At 6:08 p.m., Calvin Doss brought his bay skiff into the marina. The sun was low. The light on the water was the color it gets in August, when the angle drops below 30 degrees amber and bronze, and the specific quality of late afternoon coastal gold that makes even ordinary scenes look like paintings. He moved his boat to the dock slowly, cut the engine, tied off with 2 half hitches the way he had done 10,000 times. Cole, in the observer boat 50 yards behind him, radioed in. "I have been with this angler all day. Every fish documented. Everything clean and legal. I want that on record before weigh-in." The dock was crowded by the time Calvin stepped off his skiff. Not the frenzied, chaotic crowd of sporting events in larger cities, but the specific density of a small community that knows it is watching something uncommon. Dock workers. Other anglers who had come in early and heard the radio transmissions. The camera crew, Jerome, who had abandoned his fuel station and come to watch. Darlene Hooper, who had finished her run and was standing with her arms crossed and her face composed in the expression of a scientist watching data confirm a hypothesis. Preston Aldridge III was there. He had docked 20 minutes earlier. He stood at the edge of the crowd with 2 of his companions and said nothing as Calvin walked the dock to the weigh-in station. The weigh-in was official and methodical. Each fish documented, photographed, placed on the certified scale. The tournament's head judge, a woman named Patricia Knoll who held a regional fisheries certification and had been a tournament official for 14 years, called each weight into the record. The numbers did not change in the calling. They were the same numbers Cole had recorded in the field. The final point total for Doss, Calvin confirmed, verified. Entered into the official record was the highest single-day total in the 22-year history of the Pelican Cove International Fishing Tournament, by 11 points. 11 points over the second-place record set in 2009. Patricia Noel read the total aloud. The dock was briefly, completely silent. Then Darlene Hooper started clapping, alone at first. Then Jerome. Then Cole, from the observer boat, put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled. Then the dock workers who did not know the backstory but understood from the numbers that they were looking at something historic. Then, in the specific way that crowds move when they have been given permission, the sound built into something real. 2 men near Preston Aldridge III began clapping and then stopped when they realized he was not. Preston stood with his hands in his pockets and his face performing the particular calculus of a man deciding what version of himself to be in a moment he had not prepared for. Nobody looked at him. Nobody needed to. The moment had moved past him entirely. The tournament director, Greg Faulkner, made his way through the crowd to the weigh-in station. He was carrying the certified check, because that was protocol, the sponsor payment, delivered personally by the director at the conclusion of the official weigh-in. $250,000, made out to the tournament's first-place finisher. He had made out hundreds of these checks over the years. He had made out two to Preston Aldridge III. He shook Calvin Doss's hand and offered the check with a formality that was trying sincerely to be more than formality. Calvin held the check for a moment, looked at it, turned it over, as though reading the back. Then he said, quietly enough that the people farthest from the station did not hear it immediately, but the news crew's audio equipment did. "I appreciate this. I want you to know I appreciate it." He folded the check once and held it out. Back to Greg Faulkner. A sound from the crowd, not quite confusion. Something more like the collective catching of a breath. Greg Faulkner looked at the check in Calvin's hand and did not take it. "I don't," he started. "There's a youth fishing program," Calvin said. "The Coastal Youth Foundation, out of Savannah. They're about to lose their operating grant. 37 kids from the east side of the city, mostly black kids, some of the youngest ones just starting to learn the water." A pause. "They need this more than I do." The camera was on him. He was not performing. His voice was level and unhurried, and his eyes were steady, and his posture was the posture of a man who had made this decision before he ever walked through the marina gates that morning. This was not an impulse. This was the reason. He said, "I didn't come here for $250,000. I came here because my grandson wanted to see me compete. He's 8 years old and he thinks I can do anything." Another pause. The kind that feels when you replay it like the pause before the last sentence of a long chapter. I wanted to show him what anything looks like. He pressed the check into Greg Faulkner's hand, picked up his tackle bag, picked up his rod case, and walked out of the marina the way he had walked in, slowly, deliberately, the way men move when they have nothing to prove. He was smiling. The camera crew had everything. The video clip reached 2 million views in 19 hours. It was not the victory that people shared. It was the walk. The check pressed back into Greg Faulkner's hand, and the quiet voice, and then the man in worn rubber boots, picking up his gear, and walking away from $250,000 like it was something he had already settled, in his mind before the day began. By the morning of the second day, the Coastal Youth Foundation's phone had received 67 calls from donors who had seen the clip. By the end of that week, the foundation had received 312 individual donations totaling $219,000. And the director of the foundation, a woman named Angela Pierce, appeared on a local television segment in tears, saying she had not known Calvin had done this, had not spoken to Calvin, had discovered what he had done, the same way everyone else did, by watching a cell phone video. The Pelican Cove Tournament's board of directors held an emergency meeting 4 days after the event. They voted, unanimously, to implement 3 reforms: a formal anti-discrimination policy added to all participant agreements, a zero-tolerance protocol for conduct at the registration and staging areas, and a new annual award to be given to the participant who best demonstrated sportsmanship and community contribution. They named it the DOS Standard. The first recipient of the DOS Standard was Darlene Hooper, who that same year donated her own 5th-place prize money to a different youth program, and then drove to Savannah with her boat to teach a free workshop at the Coastal Youth Foundation. Preston Aldridge III was not fined. He was not suspended. He was also not invited to the post-tournament sponsor dinner. Apex Marine Components reviewed its tournament association contracts at the end of that fiscal year and quietly chose not to renew several of them. No statement was issued. These things do not always arrive with announcements. Jerome, the 19-year-old deckhand, enrolled in a coastal resources management program at a community college that fall. When a journalist asked him why, he said he had seen something at the marina that made him realize he wanted to understand the water the way Calvin Doss understood it. Not just to work it, to know it. Calvin Doss received 41 tournament invitations over the following 8 months, from circuits in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, the Carolinas, and one international event operating out of the Bahamas. He accepted 2. Both of them he entered quietly, registered under his own name, drove his bay skiff to the launch site without sponsorship or promotional arrangement. He finished first in one and third in the other. He did not keep the prize money from either one. He gave it to the same foundation. The Coastal Youth Foundation, operating now on a full grant, restored and supplemented by the donor response, expanded its program to 69 youth participants by the following spring. One of them was a child named Marcus, 8 years old, who stood at the edge of a tidal flat on a Tuesday morning in March, with a spinning rod in both hands, watching the water the way his grandfather had taught him to watch it, not the surface, the depths. Because the surface tells you almost nothing. The depths tell you everything. Calvin stood behind him, said 3 words. True wealth is what you carry in your hands when the water gets hard. The part that stays with me, the part I cannot set down and walk away from, is not the 2 cobia or the check handed back, or the numbers on the scoring board. It is the spiral notebook, duct-taped along the spine, page 217. An entry written 14 years ago by a man who found something valuable in a place nobody else was looking, and wrote it down carefully, and waited, and kept the faith that eventually there would be a reason to use it. He did not need the world to see what he knew. He knew what he knew. He kept the notebook, and he kept showing up, and he kept reading the depths while everyone else was arguing about the surface. That is not a fishing story. That is a story about what we do with what we know when the world has decided not to ask us for it. Here is the question I want you to sit with, and I need the honest answer, not the comfortable one. You have a notebook. Maybe it is not paper and duct tape. Maybe it is 30 years of experience in a job that stopped promoting you. Maybe it is a skill you developed quietly, in private, in the early mornings before the world woke up and asked you to be ordinary. Maybe it is a thing you know how to do that the room you are in has never thought to ask you about. The question is not whether the notebook exists. I know it does. The question is, are you showing up? Not for the $250,000, not for the crowd, not even for the moment when the check changes hands and the dock goes quiet. Are you showing up for the 8-year-old who believes you can do anything? Tell me what your notebook is. 1 word in the comments. 1 word, just the thing you've been carrying. If this story landed somewhere true for you, share it with someone who has a notebook they've been keeping to themselves. They need to hear it today. Subscribe if you have not yet, because there are more of these stories to tell, stories of people who kept showing up when the room gave them every reason to walk away. And next time, I want to tell you about the night a 67-year-old Navajo weaver walked into a New York gallery auction with a piece wrapped in a grocery bag and left the room rearranged. Same story, different water, different hands. I will see you there.